And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to my channel for the weekly show. I'm sure you are all sick of it, as am I. Twitter and X has been overflowing with information about this, as has every major news media channel. But of course, the news of the world right now is the conflict that is currently going on in Israel, specifically Israel's assault on Gaza in response to the terror attacks that took place just a week ago today. So I figured what better time, what better thing to talk about than the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to say this is an issue that anytime I've discussed it always draws out the most extreme among us. And I have been accused frequently of being both a Zionist shill, an anti-Semite, terror supporter, and and most notably not a libertarian. So people on all sides have basically criticized me. My concern is not to take sides in this conflict, really just to understand what is actually going on and what I think the appropriate position anyone should take should be. It's not for me to tell you what your opinion should be. I do, however, think you should, if you're going to have a really strong opinion on something, it at least behooves you to actually understand, one, what the conflict's about, and two, the very vast history going into it, specifically the religious nature of the conflict. But before we get into this, I'm joined by my regular co-host, Night Shift 10,000, and a friend of mine who hasn't been on my show for a while, but I'm happy to have him back, the Dark Conservatarian. So by all means, say hello.
What's up?
Hello, everybody. It is nice to be back on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Anyways, before we get started, I just want to say I, of course, have biases coming into this. I don't want to deny that I do, and I would say overall, my position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, as I am neither Jewish nor a Muslim nor a Palestinian, I have no specific stake in this matter, and for that reason, I do not take sides. That being said, in all the effort I've taken to research the history behind the conflict, as well as my own Christian faith, I will say I definitely do have a bias towards the strife of Jewish people living in Israel. I do not have any bias towards the state of Israel. That is entirely a separate matter. But that is where if any biases I have come out, that's probably the side they're going to bias me towards. But I'm just simply acknowledging that beforehand. I guess Night Shift, Darkon, do either of you have any particular feelings about this before we get started, or shall we just get into discussing what's going on?
I'll let Night Shift tell his position first, I guess.
Well, in all honesty, and I do want to be part of this panel, but in all honesty, I am just so tired of the wars. I mean, the first thing, well, certainly it's not the first thing, but like the newest thing, or the newest thing before this was, of course, Ukraine and Russia. Then we all thought it was going to be China and Taiwan, and now it's Israel and Palestine and Hamas. And it's just, I'm just so tired of this whole cluster fucking going on. And you know what? I know it's not going to happen, but can the U.S. just please stay out of these things? Can we please just stay out of this whole thing and just let it go? I know we won't, but I mean, that would really please me if we could. But yeah, I really don't care about these extra players. Just, God, it's just tiring at this point.
Definitely. Darkon?
Yeah, and by the way, tell me if I end up breaking up at any point in my monologue. But I guess I'll just come out and say, I mean, it's not really that small of a secret. I am kind of biased towards Israel, or I'll just say, like, overall, I am like pro-Israel, I guess, but I have to say that with the exception, or excuse me, with the okay, I have to say that with the acknowledgement that, unfortunately, in today's day and time, with America's foreign policy interventionism and all that, that the statement of being pro-Israel, unfortunately, is marred with the implication that, oh, that must mean that you are pro-interventionism in this area. Actually, it kind of goes the same with if you say that you're pro any country in the modern world at all, like you say that you're pro-Ukraine when it comes to fighting against Russia, or pro-Taiwan against China, or anything else like that. That must be implying that you are for military interventionism in this thing. And I just want to say flat out that no, that's definitely not the case for me. I just like at least give my verbal support towards Israel, because overall, I ultimately favor them over that of Hamas, and I guess Palestine overall, but definitely Hamas. If I did have to like throw a bone to the actual interventionists, though, as opposed to like the other subjects that I mentioned, like Ukraine and Taiwan, but especially in the case of Ukraine, I don't think that they are like technically an ally or anything like that. If there was like absolutely any case of where that there would be some legitimacy to give some help, it would be in the case of Israel, I guess, because they are an actual ally. But that being said, I don't see the necessity right now, even if I was to play into that sort of point of view of things, to get involved in the Israel versus Hamas conflict. They seem to be doing fine themselves as it is already. So seems unnecessary at the moment, any point of view that you take at it.
Okay, awesome. So let's just get started with what really is the real history of this conflict. Now, I've already posted a link to my blog. A couple years ago, I made a video called "Fact Checking a Self-Hating Jew" that was in response to YouTuber Carrie Wedler regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I have a list of sources on that page. So if anyone wants to fact check me, or much of the sources that I use to do this research are listed there. Specifically, one book that I have found to be particularly helpful on this is Myths and Facts About Israel by Mitchell Bard. Now, he is obviously writing from a pro-Israeli perspective, so I acknowledge his bias in that regard, but I will say he's extremely methodical in providing all his citations for the facts that are listed throughout that book, and he addresses virtually all the questions that are asked about this conflict in great detail. So I do recommend that resource specifically. But I put up this post that's been going around X in light of this conflict, and goes around in anytime the Israeli-Palestinian conflict comes up. And pretty much the conventional wisdom that a lot of people worldwide have about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially those that are more in favor of the Palestinians, is essentially the narrative they will probably tell you is that prior to 1946, Palestine was an Arab country where the indigenous population of Palestinians were living there in peace, minding their own business, just wanting to be left alone. The Zionists, uninvited and unprovoked, rolled into the country, started attacking Arabs and violently kicking them out of their homes. They had the backing of the British government to do this. In 1947, and you see on this chart here that what they say is that in 1946, the entire area that we now call Israel was Palestine. Then in the UN plan, split it up and made it into Palestine and Israel, where there had been no previous Jewish state. Then after the 6-Day War, Israel took more land, and now look at how little land is controlled by the Palestinians. Basically, this is a example of a historical case where the Arabs were living here peacefully and prosperously. The Jews rolled in uninvited and violently kicked them out of their homes. And to this day, the Jews are oppressing the Palestinian people, or at least that is the narrative that is constantly sold to the public, particularly by those that are more in favor of the Palestinians. Now, I will say this is just simply ahistorical. So what is the actual history of the land that we now call Israel/Palestine? Well, for one, I don't think anyone can deny that the region called Israel is in fact the historic land of the Jewish people. Whether from the Bible to all archaeological evidence, it supports the Jews did in fact live in the region at one point. In the days of the Roman Empire, particularly about 70 AD, there was a Jewish revolt against the Romans in which the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and King Solomon's the Second Temple that existed in Jerusalem. By about 135 AD, the Jews were forcibly exiled from the region by the Romans, And at the time, the region now called Israel was largely referred to as Judea. After the Romans kicked the Jews out, particularly in punishment for their failed revolution, they went on to name the region Palestine, which was derived from Philistia, which was the name of another people that had previously lived there that had been the enemy of Israel. And for the record, the actual region there in the Middle East, the sand is literally stained by the blood of thousands of years of warfare. Throughout all of history, there have been multiple groups of people who have lived here, some of which were exterminated, some of which were kicked out. A lot of warfare and a lot of evil has been done here. So for anyone to claim they are the one indigenous people to this region is asinine. But moving on. The term Palestine derives from, at least originally, from the Romans, not from Arabs living in the land of Israel. Now, at least for a portion of the time, the land was controlled by the Romans. Later, after Islam would arise in the 7th century and the original Arab conquest of the region, it would fall under the control of the original Muslim Arab Empire, and then later into the hands of the Turkish and the Ottoman Empire, and they would go on to control it for centuries. Now, during that entire time, I think it is important to note that while the Ottomans or the Arabs or the Romans controlled the region, never at any point was there an indigenous group of people who referred to themselves as Palestinians. The term Palestine was used to refer to the region, but that was always under a larger empire that controlled it. Right. And incidentally, during that time, the land became a barren wasteland. I think it was American author Mark Twain visited the region of Palestine in the late 1800s, and he came back and, to paraphrase, basically said, "This is a shithole. Why would anyone want to live here?" At the time, there were groups of Arabs that were living there, but they were more or less nomadic. They did not refer to themselves as Palestinians, and they had no special connection to the land. There were Jews living there, and interestingly enough, despite the Roman exile, all throughout history, there were still Jews that lived there. Now, granted, they can be a very small minority at some point, but at no point were there no Jews living in the region. Obviously, post-World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and much of the Middle East came under the control of the British, which brings us to the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, what is in the picture that I had put up there, which I'll put it back up for a second.
Yeah, didn't the British originally give those lands to the Jewish people after World War II?
Pretty well. It's more complicated than that. But okay. Basically, what's important is this picture here in 1946, where it says all this region is Palestine. What is so deceptive about this meme is that this was not an independent country called Palestine, ruled by an indigenous population of Palestinians. This was the British Mandate of Palestine. In other words, the entire region, and then next to it, the region of Transjordan. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire post-World War I, the British controlled the region, and they created what was originally, all that area was called the British Mandate of Palestine. Later, they ended up breaking it up into the British Mandate of Palestine and the British Mandate of Transjordan. At the time, there were both Jews and Arabs were living in the region at this time, and both of them were referred to as Palestinians. That was not a term that exclusively referred to Jews or Palestinians. It referred to people living in the region. Now, it's beyond the scope of this particular live stream to go into all the historical players that were involved in this. I encourage everyone to do their own research. In particular, Myths and Facts on Israel is a very succinct source, but I would also recommend The Palestinian Delusion by Robert Spencer. There are numerous other texts that go into this in great detail. But to try and make a long story short, basically we had three different going into the early 1900s, pre-World War II, there were several different players in this equation. You had the British, who had just come under control of this region. You had the Arabs, who, following the fall of the Ottoman Empire, really did not have a unified view of nationally, but there was an evolving movement called pan-Arab nationalism, where Arabs all throughout the Middle East basically wanted to reunite under their Arab Islamic identity. And of course, you had the early Zionist movement, and that was Jews saying that we've been without a homeland ever since the Romans kicked us out in 135 AD. Jews everywhere need to go back to Israel and found our own Jewish state, specifically because at this point, anti-Semitism in Europe is getting pretty bad. This is pre-World War II and prior to the rise of Hitler, but that's going to come very shortly. And the early Zionist movement basically said, we're never going to be safe from anti-Semitism. No one really likes us, and everywhere we go, we get persecuted. The only thing we can do is form a state of our own. And Night Shift, do you have a comment there?
No. This is covering it pretty well, actually.
Okay. Now, what I can say here is that what needs to be absolutely clear is that players in the early Zionist movement were not necessarily good guys. Members of the early Zionist movement ultimately sometimes admitted that they helped foster anti-Semitism in European countries in an effort to try and get Jews to try and immigrate to what would become the modern state of Israel. So that's not to say the people in the modern Zionist, that the Zionist movement is full of good people. It's not. And in fact, a lot of the conspiracy theories about, secret Zionist groups aren't entirely inaccurate. But I think what's important to state is that just because someone says they are a Zionist does not mean that they are part of a particular group or support specific policies. Broadly speaking, Zionists are people who say, we are members of the Jewish people and we want to have our own country. Now, do I consider myself a Zionist? No, because I'm not Jewish. I have no particular stake in that claim. I think if Jews want to live in their historic homeland, great. They should be free to move there, purchase their own property, live and prosper. And interestingly enough, a lot of the early Zionists did that. It's not that the idea that Jews came in guns blazing, trying to kick the Arabs off their land is historically just false. They, for the most part, yes, were they trying to immigrate there, but many of them tried to purchase land and just wanted to live in the region. Right. Now, here's where we get to the first. It is absolutely impossible to understand this conflict if you don't understand the religious nature of this conflict. Again, I'm not going to say that I cannot say all Muslims believe this, all Jewish people believe this. What you can say is that what you can do is look at what specific, what the Islamic texts like the Quran and the Hadith say. You can look at what specific Muslim groups say, and you can look at what the general sentiment among large groups of Muslims are towards Jews. And that is that specifically in Islam, Jews are Jewish control of land is a major taboo. Now, it gets a little complicated because when you understand the history of Islam, Muhammad initially claimed that he was a prophet in a line of prophets that originally started with Jewish prophets and included Jesus, and then it came to him. And when he initially started his religious campaign, if you will, he thought, or at least it would appear he thought, that Jews and Christians were going to just accept him and say, yeah, you are a prophet, we'll follow you. Well, of course, that didn't happen, and he started to get mad, and we can see that through the history of Quranic revelations. When early on in his career, when Muhammad was the persecuted religious minority, he said a lot of stuff about religious freedom and tolerance and things like that. However, later on, when he developed a large military following and started to get more powerful, suddenly he changed all this and he started developing a message of kill the infidels, Islam is supreme, we must establish a worldwide state and put all non-Muslims in subjugation. So it's, and of course, according to what has come to be called the Islamic doctrine of abrogation, Quranic texts that occur later in the history of Muhammad supersede revelations that come later on. And I think here is where it's appropriate to look at the actual covenant of the terror group Hamas, which I'm going to pull up for a second. Obviously, Hamas does not exist at this point, but the texts from which they draw their beliefs have existed for a long time. So the following is an excerpt from the Hamas covenant. This is the terror group that is currently in Gaza. They say, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It needs all sincere efforts. The Islamic resistance movement is but one squadron that should be supported until the enemy is vanquished and Allah's victory is realized. It strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. It is one of the links in the chain of the struggle against the Zionist invaders. The Prophet, Allah grant him salvation, has said, and this is a quotation from a particular hadith that is very popular, especially among Islamic groups and Islamic terror groups. is the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. When the Jew will hide behind the stones and trees, the stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him." There is no solution for the Palestine question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. Palestine is an Islamic land. Of course, we'll end the quote there. Darkhan, did you follow up?
No, well, intentionally. It wasn't unintentional, but yeah.
Okay.
Bring me back in so I can be on my desktop instead of my laptop.
Okay, no problem. But basically, there is a very strong sentiment in Islam, or at least, not again, I can't monolithically say all Muslims believe this. What I can say is that there are large groups of Muslims, particularly those that lean towards extremism, that believe that it is a divine command from God that they should exterminate Jews from the earth. So, and you cannot understand this conflict if you don't understand that that is where Hamas and many Muslim groups are coming from when they look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, so jumping back into the history, this is still pre-World War II. As the British are seeking to develop this region, I think one of the shadier things the British government did is they effectively tried to play both sides of this issue. They promised the Jewish community that they would found a Jewish state. At the same time, they promised the Arab community that they would found an Arab state and that they would further Arab interests. As the history moved along, they more or less realized, Arabs and Jews living in this region really don't have any intention of living peacefully with one another. Arab leaders at the time, to include the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, was extremely outspoken in his hatred of Jews. He encouraged Arabs in the region to attack Jews. Now, in fairness, the Jews in the region were not innocent either. There were, in fact, Zionist terrorist groups like Lehi and Haganah who committed violence against Arabs. And I have to say, as a libertarian, I see violence on all sides as unacceptable. But the point is, no one was innocent in this early conflict. There were people trying to live in peace, but by and large, the Arabs, especially their leadership, were pretty clear that they had no intention of allowing a Jewish state to be founded, and that they would fight and murder innocent Jews if necessary to prevent a Jewish state from being founded.
So
of course,
sorry
most of this.
Put a pause on what you're saying, but is this like many years back, or are we talking about the current conflict right now?
Okay, we're still in the 1930s at this point.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I need to be clear about this is anyone who says, the Jews are the invaders or the Arabs are the invaders really doesn't understand the conflict. Neither the Arabs were not indigenous to the population, to the area. The region called Palestine in the 1800s was a complete shithole. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the British took control and Jews began moving to the area. The Arabs did not like this and started attacking Jews in the area. Jews, particularly members of some Zionist groups, actually founded their own militias, if you will, which effectively ended up becoming terrorist groups. I'm not ashamed to call them that. And British, Arabs, and Jews ended up getting massacred in these constant struggles, which violence on all sides is unacceptable. However, it's unfair to say that the Jews initiated the violence. I think an honest look at history shows that the violence more or less originates from the fact that Arabs, deriving from an Islamic base, believed that it was against their religion to allow Jews to control, to have a state in the land, and that it was necessary to use violence if necessary to stop this. So, of course, this is more or less put on hold during World War II. The Jews, of course, side with the British. The Arabs side with the Nazis. And the war pops off. Hitler announces his final solution for the Jews, and unfortunately, about 6 million Jews lose their lives in the Holocaust. At this point, there is now a much wider. After what they had just endured, Jews who survived the Holocaust more or less say, you know what? I think these Zionists are onto something. Look at what just happened to us. If we want to be safe, I think it is a good idea that we have our own state. We should, and many of them become Zionists and decide we need to move to the land that will eventually become Israel. There's quite a bit of effort on the British to do this peacefully. At the request of the Arabs, they restrict the number of Jews that can immigrate to the area. I think it was something like 75,000 per year. moving up to the mid-1940s, where we get to the UN Partition Plan, which is the thing that everyone talks about. And I will go ahead and post the, hang on, let's post that meme again.
By the way, did you know that little fun fact that I got from listening to Destiny streams about this issue in recent days? Did you know that apparently Palestinians do not like being referred to as Arabs?
Yes, and that has changed. I will say that has changed quite a bit. But anyways, getting to the UN Partition Plan of 1947, basically the British, and I guess I should have mentioned it. The first time there was talk of a independent Jewish state was in 1937, following the Peel Commission. The British government basically proposed that about 80% of the land, British mandated Palestine, be given to the Arabs, and about 20% be given to the Jews. So the Jews were offered a very small portion of the land for an independent state. Interestingly enough, the Jews said, you know, it's not a lot, but we'll take it. The Arabs said, we won't take it. We want, we refuse to accept an independent Jewish state. So that was the first time a two-state solution was talked about. The Jews accepted it. The Arabs said, we reject it. Now, in 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan here where, and a common claim you're going to hear is that the Jews were offered 55% of the land. The Arabs were offered 45% of the land. So this was not a fair deal. Okay, that's technically true. But when it came to the UN partition plan, the problem was Jewish and Arab communities were interspersed all throughout the British Mandate of Palestine, and it was extremely difficult for them to draw any sort of borders that wouldn't force some communities of Arabs and some communities of Jews to relocate. A large portion of the land that was given to Israel was the Negev, which was just basically empty desert. So whether or not this was fair, I mean, that's a point to debate, but it wasn't easy to come up with a split that was going to please everybody. Basically, the UN just put this forward and said, okay, can the Arabs have a state over here? Can the Jews have the state over here? And can we all just get along? Nobody's going to be happy all the time, but can we please just put this to bed once and for all? The Jews said, yes, we will take the state. The Arabs said, no, we will not. And in fact, every Arab country, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, all declared war against Israel at this point. Now, here is where and this is where we get to what eventually becomes called the Palestinian refugee crisis, which, unfortunately, I know I'm breezing over a lot of it. So there is a lot that happened here, and I can't possibly in one live stream do justice to all the history, but I'm trying to summarize this as fairly as possibly can be done. And
yeah,
that is that.
Recap for my sake, we're still in 1947, right? When you say that Egypt declared war on Israel?
That is correct.
That was in the 60s. Wait.
Okay,
no, that's you're thinking of the 6 Day War. That's late. That comes later. This is the This is basically the Israeli War for independence.
That's what I had to clarify as well, because I definitely know that they fought each other in the 60s, but I would not rule it out if they ended up having multiple different wars with each other. So,
and I'm going to pull up one important quote that comes from here. So hang on.
By the way, how loud is the clicking of my mouse right now?
It's not terrible.
I'm not really hearing it.
Gotcha.
Hang on.
Toasted Network in the live chat has a question. Whenever we want to get around to the 60s, I believe his question relates to that era.
Okay, which quote is that? Toasted Network. Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah,
how that map timeline video was shared by someone named Ministry of Truth. Oh, wait, no. How do you respond to the whole USS Liberty claim by gripers? We will get to that later on. In fact, I don't think that's terribly relevant to the history of at large. But basically, all 5 Arab nations declared war against the state of Israel, and notable Arab leaders told Arabs living in the area, leave your homes and flee to safety because we are about to exterminate Jews. Hang on. I'm going to mute my mic for a minute while I find this quote. If you guys have anything more to say, by all means, please do.
I guess for right now, what I have to say is I've seen this chart before. It would have been like a few years back. I don't know what my original opinion. Actually, I did not know the full history of the country when I was like, or the area, might I say, when I was like really young. So this chart was like new information for me at the time, many years ago, and so I was thinking to myself, oh, back in 1947 or pre-1947, it was really all claimed it to Palestine. Okay, well, in spite of that, I still maintain the same position as I do as far as Native American, former Native American lands here in America goes. I mean, do we really want to displace the current residents because of what past, mostly dead residents lived at? And it's like, supposedly stolen land. Or might have been in fact stolen land, but the original victims of that stolen land aren't hardly alive, if at all, for that, so forth. But hearing the little historical fact about that, it wasn't really actually technically Palestinian land. It was more like British land that, it was a British land that they appropriated for the settlement of Palestinians, I guess. And it was like, it might not technically be the right terminology what I'm about to use here, but it was essentially like a British colony, I guess, back in those times.
Yes.
Until they decided to use that colonial land for resettling Jews to get a good chunk of them out of Europe, because apparently Europeans did not like Jews at the time.
Definitely. And I think what's important to note is that when the British Mandate of Palestine came into the control of the British, there was not an indigenous population of people who called themselves Palestinians, that like, this is our home, we live in the land of Palestine, we've lived here for thousands of years, and this is our culture. That was non-existent. There were small groups of Arabs that had immigrated to the land later. They had lived there during the time of the Ottoman Empire, but you have to remember the region itself was largely desert wasteland. It's not like people really wanted to live there. They were Arabs that did live there, but they did not call themselves Palestinians, and they did not have any unique connect, like, this is our land, we love this land, and we've lived on it for thousands of years. No, they happened to be here. They were Arab, and they did not call themselves Palestinians. But anyways, getting to this particular quote. So when the Lebanese, Syrian, Iraqi, and Egyptian armies and Jordanian had all declared war on the new state of Israel, there's an interesting quote here that comes from Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League. This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades. So in other words, the Arab countries that invaded Israel when it was first founded were not at all unclear about their intentions. They said, we intend to exterminate the Jews. They had the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem during World War II had been a collaborator with Adolf Hitler himself. The general Arab sentiment was that Jews may not have an independent state, and we can see from their own leadership statements, they had no intention of living peaceably with an independent Jewish state. Their goal was to kill all Jews. So now, miraculously,
for the sake of argument, is there like any Israeli civilians that call for the absolute, big time Israeli citizen figures, political figures within Israel who call for the extinguishment of Palestinians?
Not that I'm aware of. What I can say. What I can say is that there were indeed Zionist terrorist groups like Haganah, Lehi, who incited violence against Arabs in pursuit of their cause. But the Jewish community in general denounced those individuals. They said that there were, at all times throughout this conflict, there have been people on the Jewish side, some of whom who were considered extremists, who were willing to use violence to advance their ends, but they were not calling for the extermination of Arabs in the region. They were, and there were notable voices on their side saying, we do not support the actions of these terrorists. On the other hand, among the Arabs, the general sentiment did seem to be no Jewish state, or at best, no Jewish state, at worst, exterminate the Jews. And they were extremely open about this fact. So,
not to say that I have been like the absolute most privy when it comes to this subject in general, but it almost seems to be more that there are like, I guess, more extreme people on the right here in America that seem to want to advocate for the extinguishing of Palestinians, to just absolutely glass the entire area and take it over entirely as a part of Israel, like commit like some kind of mini genocide against the people living within that small area, more than it seems to be like at least big time voices within Israel who call for that sort of solution to things. In which, to clarify, none of us actually advocate for the absolute obliteration of all Palestinians with the area, right?
No.
In the area, right?
No,
Absolutely not. And like I said,
Okay.
we're going to get to the modern state of the conflict, but I would that is people who, I will say this, I have been disturbed by the amount of particularly Americans, but even some Israelis who have been in the recent days have been calling to level Gaza. If you say that you support wiping out an entire population because of something a terrorist did, you are no better than those terrorists. So
Really?
no, I absolutely categorically reject that.
Yeah, and if people want to like equivalent that to Japan, remember this: we only nuked, at least in that situation, we only nuked 2 cities in Japan. We did not nuke the entire set of islands that was Japan.
Exactly.
Japan.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, so Israel was attacked, and the leaders of the Arab armies at this time said unequivocally their goal was to exterminate Jews. Now, a lot of Arabs that were living in the area, they said, leave your homes, flee to safety, and as soon as we've exterminated the Jews, you can come right back. Now, I think what is unfortunate, and a historical fact is, during this war, Israel ended up kicking out a number of Arabs from their homes. I shouldn't just say a large number of Arabs from their homes. But at this point, it's pretty. I don't know if there's anyone who can claim conclusively to know how many Arabs left because their leaders themselves told them to leave, and how many were forcibly kicked out by Israel. Trying to determine that at this point is virtually impossible. And of course, the Arabs did not help their case in that they launched a war against Israel and said that their goal was to exterminate the Jews. So what is true and terribly unfortunate is that a lot of Arabs, the ones who would later go on to call themselves Palestinians, lost their homes. It's equally true that a lot of Jews were killed in this conflict and also lost their homes. War is terrible, and it's terrible for all sides. But the reality of the situation is against all odds, Israel won the war, and as a result, came under control of even more land than they otherwise would have had. Had the Arabs simply taken the Partition Plan, they would right now be living in a state alongside the Jewish state, but instead, Israel controls much more of the land. Right. Now, getting into the Six-Day War, which happens later in 1967, about 20 years after this, we run into a unique situation. Well, I should say unique situation in history where this was a war of aggression on Israel's part. They attacked first. At the same time, it's difficult to say that their actions were unprovoked, because what was a situation where Egypt, in particular, there was a UN peacekeeping force between Egypt and Israel in the Sinai Desert. Egypt said, we want that UN peacekeeping force removed, and then proceeded to start building up troops on the Israeli border. The strait, which, actually, let me, before I go into this and start butchering everything, let me pull up the fact sheet here. All right, so in 1967, there was basically a combination of Arab rhetoric, threatening behavior, and the closing of a canal that supplied oil to Israel that basically put Israel in a situation where the Egyptian army was building, the UN peacekeeping force had been removed from the Sinai Desert. The Egyptians were starting to build up military forces on Israel's border. Other countries in the region, such as Jordan and Lebanon, were threatening to get involved. And Israel was essentially put in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If Israel did nothing, they ultimately would have run out of energy because there were no shipments of oil coming in, and would have been extremely vulnerable to attack. And there was plenty of Arab rhetoric at the time saying we want to destroy Israel. As a result, Israel struck first and miraculously again won the war. Now, again, I need to be clear. This was, technically speaking, a war of aggression on Israel's part. They were the ones that attacked first. However, you can't say it was unprovoked either, given it came at a time when they were cut off from shipments of energy. They had foreign armies building up on their border, and there was a great deal of rhetoric saying, we want to destroy you. I mean, hard to say that I wouldn't have done the same in the same situation. So again, that doesn't mean I'm on the side of the state of Israel, but it means that from the time of its founding onward, Israel faced existential threats all around itself.
Yeah, imagine if, say, for a completely arbitrary and rhetorical hypothetical example, Mexico and Canada decide to ally up with each other and decide to cut off all of our shipment lanes for oil.
That actually happened to Japan in World War II. It was actually the reason for the Pearl Harbor attack. That was literally the reason the United States cut Japan off from their oil. And that's actually why they attacked us at Pearl Harbor, is because they were running out. So, I mean, even then.
Exactly. So I guess the same logic on Israel's part could also be applied on Japan's part. Is the point you're making?
Yeah.
Exactly. And, it's important to note that doesn't necessarily make Japan the good guys any more than it necessarily makes Israel the good guys in this conflict. Right. But the thing is, you cannot say the Pearl Harbor attack was unprovoked. It was not. And you can't say that Israel's attack against Egypt in the Six-Day War was unprovoked either. The IDF pretty much and I'll read a quote here from let me find it. All right, so let me just share the screen here. All right, so pretty much reading this section here from Mitchell Bard's book, the Arab rhetoric was matched by the mobilization of Arab forces. Approximately 250,000 troops, more than 2,000 tanks, and 700 aircraft ringed Israel. By this time, Israel's forces had been on alert for 3 weeks. The country could not remain fully mobilized indefinitely, nor could it allow its sea lane through the Gulf of Aqaba to be interdicted. Israel's best option was to strike first. On June 5th, 1967, the order was given to attack Egypt. By using the element of surprise, Israeli forces managed to break through the enemy lines after just 6 days of fighting and were in a position to march on Cairo, Damascus, and Amman. A ceasefire was invoked on June 10th. The victory came at an extremely high cost. In storming the Golan Heights, Israel suffered 115 dead, roughly the number of Americans killed during Operation Desert Storm. Altogether, Israel lost twice as many men, 777 dead, 2,585 wounded, in proportion to her total population, as the United States lost in 8 years of fighting in Vietnam. Approximately 18,000 Arab fighters died. Additionally, despite the incredible success of the air campaign, the Israeli Air Force lost 46 of its 200 fighters. So in other words, yes, Israel attacked first, but you can't say it was an unprovoked attack either.
Although, didn't Israel's territory triple during the 6 Days War? Because they actually were able to secure the Golan Heights, and they were able to even secure part of Egypt. So
exactly, they took the entire Sinai Desert, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Now here's where the interesting part gets in, because a lot of people will try to argue that Israel is now that the modern state of Israel wants to genocide the Palestinian people. That's a common claim. I've seen plenty of people posting it on X recently. What you have to know, it has been quite some time since 1967 when the Gaza Strip and the West Bank now fell into control of Israel. Israel later on gave the entire Sinai Desert back to Egypt in exchange for peace. The West Bank was offered to Jordan, although they didn't want it. The Gaza Strip was offered to Egypt, although they didn't want it. And Israel continues to hang on to the Golan Heights, although I would say that is not out of any particular attachment they have to that region, but because it is strategically located for their military purposes. Now, is that right or wrong? We can debate that, but the point is they don't hang on to it because, we want more land. And a lot of people say Israel is just in a land grab. All they want is to conquer more and more land. Well, if that's the case, why did they give the entire Sinai Desert back to Egypt? Why did they offer Gaza back to Egypt? Why did they offer the West Bank to Jordan? This is if Israel wants to just grab more and more territory, they're not exactly proving with their actions if that's what they want to do. And further, the Arab-Palestinian at this point, it's around the time of the 6 Day War that the Palestinian Arabs begin really officially calling themselves Palestinians. Up to this point, there has, at least back in 1947, there really was no notion of a Palestinian people or people who identify as Palestinians. Coming around the time of the 6 Day War, that's when that rhetoric really picks up, and you have the Palestinian Liberation Organization founded and such. But interesting to note that in that time, since the time period of 1948 through the present, the Palestinian population has multiplied about eightfold. Israel has given back the Sinai deserts, and made multiple peace offers that have been rejected. So the bottom line is, if you say Israel wants to genocide the Palestinians, I have to tell you history, they are doing the most terrible job of it ever, because the Palestinian population is growing. And although they've had opportunities to hang on to land that they've seized in warfare, they've been willing to give it back or at least negotiate. Now, does that mean Israel is necessarily the good guys in everything? No, absolutely not. No. But that is that's the history leading up to this point. Now, I already read from this earlier from the Hamas covenant that basically says the terrorist group that currently controls Gaza, they say in their charter very clearly and unequivocally, we are not interested in peace. We are interested in the destruction of the state of Israel and killing all Jews worldwide. In fact, they quote from the Islamic hadiths, the end of the world cannot come about until the Muslims fight the Jews, and nature itself will cry out, oh, Muslims, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come kill him. So at this point, with all that in context, the important thing to understand is that the Palestinians, starting back from the time of the Peel Commission to the UN partition of 1947, through the 6-Day War, later on we're going to get to the peace talks that take place during the Clinton administration, the peace talks that take place later during the Obama administration. On no less than 5 separate occasions, Israel came to the table and said, we would like peace. Here is what we are offering for the Palestinians to have their own state. In every single case, the Palestinian leadership, be it the Palestinian Authority, who is the political party that has control in what's called the West Bank, or Hamas, which is what has control in the Gaza Strip, have never even come back with a counteroffer. They have basically walked out of the peace talks and responded by attacking Israel. So I say that to point out that, again, I'm not saying Israel is the good guys in this situation, but for those that say I am on the side of peace, peace has been on the table ever since the founding of the state of Israel. Peace has been on the table multiple times. The Jews have at least come to the table and said, we're willing to offer peace. Here's what we're willing to offer. Without even coming back with a counteroffer, the Palestinian leadership, at least, and again, not to say the state of Israel represents all Jews or the Palestinian leadership represents all Palestinians, have said their position is unequivocally, we are not interested in peace with Israel. We want the entire state destroyed. Mm-hmm. And further, because this is not merely a conflict over territory, but a deeply religious conflict in which we believe that it is our duty to exterminate the Jews from the earth, even if Israel right now gave the entirety of the land, ceased to exist, and gave it to the Palestinians, the Hamas and their followers have been very clear. We will not stop trying to kill all Jews. We have, similar terrorist groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, who have stated, the leader of Hezbollah has stated, I want all Jews to gather in Israel because that saves me. At least then I can attack them all at once, and it saves me the trouble of having to hunt them down globally. So pretty much anyone who thinks this is just a conflict about 2 different groups of people wanting to occupy the same land, and Jews unprovoked and uninvited came in and took this land away from an indigenous group of people called Palestinians who were deeply connected to the land. That's all just a bunch of crap. I'm sorry. Historically, we have the primary sources. That's not what happened. Now, does that mean everything Israel is doing right now is just? No. But no. The question needs to be asked because I think a lot of my fellow libertarians, and I respect their opinion, but I think not having adequate understanding of the history leading up to this, a lot of people try to say, I'm not on the side of Israel or the side of Palestine. I'm on the side of peace. And what we need to do is stop violence on all sides and move forward with negotiated peace talks so that they can both have their own state. In principle, I would like to agree. The problem is the history of this conflict shows that at least one side, namely the Palestinians, and again, I can't say all Palestinians necessarily agree with their leadership, but if there is one, I'm unable to find it. There is no, to my knowledge, Palestinian party that has come forward saying, look, we don't hate Jews, we don't hate Israel, we just want peace. and the right to live in our own land. Let's come to the table and negotiate. That party is non-existent. You have the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. You have Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Both of them have stated clearly, we don't want peace. We want to destroy Israel. We want, and not just Israel, but we want to kill all Jews, not just the one in Israel, but worldwide.
I've heard rhetoric be used that because that the Palestinians have voted in Hamas as their leadership, that therefore the Palestinians are responsible directly or indirectly, probably more likely indirectly, for the violence that happens in Israel nowadays because, well, again, they voted them in. But the thing is, they don't seem to have any difference of options. I mean, it seems by what you just said there, my 2 cents, that all the leadership, like you just said, they want to all just kill Israelis and so forth. So it's like damned
if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Really?
And like I said, the people that I feel worse for in this are, the civilians, the Palestinian children that have been born into horrible conditions in the West Bank and Gaza, whose parents and leadership, rather than use the resources at their disposal to help build a better life for their children, they use every cent of foreign aid they receive to build rockets to attack Israel. They raise their kids to hate Jews and openly state, again, I can't paint with a broad brush, not every Palestinian believes this, but there have been enough coming forward saying, we hate Israel so much, we are happy to see our own children die because so long as it helps us achieve our goal of destroying Israel. And it's been appropriately said, if Palestinians loved their own children more than they hated Israel, there would be peace in the region. And I think, unfortunately, that's true. I really wish there was an outspoken group of Palestinian civilians who would rise up in Gaza or the West Bank and say, we've had enough of Hamas. We've had enough of the Palestinians. We need to get these guys out of power and work towards peace. But unfortunately, those people are either don't exist or they're so few in number that they don't have what it takes to overthrow Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, unfortunately. And you are correct. In 2006, Hamas was elected by the people of the Gaza Strip to represent them. Now, does that mean everyone living in the Gaza Strip necessarily supports Hamas? No, but at least enough of them do that they've been able to hang on to power and not hold on to any elections since.
Kind of wondered of what the approval polls were, if we are able to find those.
You know what? I can go ahead and Google that and see if I can find. And it'd be hard to tell how accurate those polls would be, anyways. But let's go ahead and see if I can find that.
Yeah, because quite bluntly, it's one of the biggest shitholes out there, so it's hard to get an organized census.
According to the Washington Institute, about 57% of Gazans express a positive opinion of Hamas.
Wow.
Okay, so that's more than, again, who's to say how reliable that poll is, but that's more than half. So more than half of the citizens in Gaza say they have a positive view of a terrorist organization that says we want to destroy Israel and kill all Jews. And certainly, from what's been going on in the last week, not to say all reports of what happened in Israel are necessarily true. After that, we've been talking for almost an hour now just to talk about the history of it. But I think with all that as history, it's important. Now we can talk about what's actually going on now. So last Sunday, there was an attack from Gaza into Israel, and it's reported that at least 1,000 Israelis were killed. Now there have been this is not to say all reports is necessarily true. There have been some particular claims that have been widely reported but not substantiated. The most popular one right now being that there were 40 Israeli babies that were beheaded. Although that has been widely reported, I've not seen any specific evidence that is true. Now, granted, do I believe Hamas would absolutely do something like that? Yes. At the same time, unless I see the evidence, I'm not just going to parrot it as though it's true. It's something I certainly believe they would do, but it also appears like I'm not going to deny the fact that is very useful propaganda on Israel's part, and I would not see them above report. Again, I do not support the state of Israel. The state of Israel is every bit as corrupt as the United States government. I have fully believe it has committed just as many crimes as the United States government, and I can for those that will call me a Zionist shill, I can assure you I have no love for the state of Israel. By that we mean the government. But,
yeah, the whole thing about the beheaded baby claim, it's like you already have like I'd say probably most of the West supporting you in your retaliation against Hamas. You do not need to try and exaggerate and inflate the numbers of your deaths. Just like in the same way that the Ukrainian government does not need to lie, dishonestly inflate their numbers of civilian deaths in order to get people on their side in their retaliation against Russia. I mean, pretty much the majority already says that, yeah, Russia is wrong for their invasion. But really, Ukraine just cannot help themselves, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I'm more than willing to agree to that. Now, yeah, would Hamas do something like that? Would they start decapitating Israeli babies and citizens? Of course they would. But I really need to see some more evidence on that to believe it myself. So I do agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So now getting on, here's my biggest criticism of the state of Israel at this point, and their role in this conflict is how exactly did they not see this attack coming? Now, Mossad, which is basically Israel's equivalent to the CIA, is supposedly one of the greatest intelligence services in the world. Egypt has reported that they tried to warn Israel that this was coming, but it seems more or less Israel is caught with its pants down and a lot of innocent civilians got killed. Now, is it entirely possible that much like FDR and Pearl Harbor, the U.S. actually had one, as Night Shift pointed out, Pearl Harbor was not exactly unprovoked. It doesn't mean the Japanese were right in what they did, but it wasn't unprovoked either. And there is evidence to suggest that FDR had warning of that Pearl Harbor was coming and more or less just let it happen because he needed an excuse to get the U.S. involved in World War II, which, of course, is despicable, though it doesn't make what the Japanese did anymore. It doesn't make the lost lives any less horrific to Americans on that day. So I think it is entirely possible that the state of Israel knew this was coming and more or less decided not to do anything about it because they wanted to be able to use it as propaganda for an attack against Gaza. If that turns out to be true, and I think it's likely, then the people within the Israeli government need to be outed and they need to be held accountable for that. There's no excuse for if you have the means to protect your civilians and you don't, that's absolutely a crime. And I think the same goes for any American politicians who had an inkling that 9/11 was coming, but also chose to do nothing about it because they wanted justification to wage war against the Middle East. I think everybody knows who I'm talking about when I mention that. But of course, right. That's a separate claim. So Israel is not innocent. At best case scenario, their intelligence service was completely incompetent and they failed to protect their own people, in which case they need to be fired. Israel, they knew this was coming and they deliberately chose to do nothing about it, in which case they need to be criminally prosecuted.
So that kind of raises the question, for the sake of conversation, how culpable is Netanyahu in that? Or is it just Mossad that would be more culpable because they, for some reason, did not decide to inform their head honcho, that being Netanyahu, about this?
Well, I guess I'm always of the opinion when it comes to anyone who understands what it means to be a leader means you are responsible for everything the people under you do, whether you are directly involved or not. If corruption exists within a private company and the CEO is unaware of it, but it later comes to light, I mean, as the CEO of the company, he is the chief executive officer. He's responsible for everything that does or does not happen in the company, whether he directly caused it himself. So I think in that regard, is Netanyahu responsible? Absolutely. He is the head of the Israeli government. And as a result, he's responsible for everything they do or fail to do. Does that mean he was personally directly involved? Not necessarily. That's something that an investigation would have to bear out. I think, unfortunately, because of how governments are set up, they tend not to investigate themselves. So much like crimes in the U.S. about covering up or letting 9/11 happen will probably never come to light. Such crimes in Israel may never come to light, but I'm just calling it out because it seems pretty likely.
So I'd have to say that if Netanyahu is not maliciously negligent in his specific duties as far as what he knew or did not know, if he really was ignorant, then beforehand, at least anyways, that at the bare least to wash off any culpabilities that he would have to fire the people at Mossad for not informing him.
Exactly. And I mean, if it came up that if he found out that, yeah, we knew about this, but we chose not to do anything, I mean, fire him at minimum, fire him, actually put him under some kind of criminal indictment. I'm not familiar with Israeli law, but I'd say that there's a pretty good chance they violated their oath of office by failing to do that.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Anyways, no, that being said, just because that's a crime, either extreme negligent or criminal on Israel's part, that does not mean that Jewish civilians were not killed and that what Hamas did was not an attempt at genocide. Now, here's what the word genocide has been thrown around a lot over the past couple of days, both referring to what Hamas did and to what Israel's doing in retaliation. I need to be clear. Genocide is a particular type of crime that is seeking to eliminate an entire population. The Holocaust was genocide. Hitler's goal was to exterminate the Jews. Hamas's attack, well, it didn't accomplish genocide. It was genocidal. Why? Because Hamas has stated clearly and unequivocally that their goal is to exterminate Jews from the earth. So that is what genocide is.
The intentional target was innocent civilians, whereas in Israel's case, the innocent civilians they end up killing, that being Palestinians specifically, just end up being like accidental, if that's even the right adjective, collateral damage. So it's not really applicable. Yeah.
Right.
Now,
also, I want to bring up something that Death End said. Death End basically was like 40 children killed and some were beheaded. I believe that more than anything. I really believe that more than anything is what happened.
So of course
there's a game of telephone that was played.
So now that brings us to the question: Israel's response, is it just? Now this, I think, you cannot really, without understanding all the history leading up to this, you can't really adequately judge this. I think a lot of people, not knowing the history behind this conflict, look at what Israel is doing and say, you know, it is abhorrent that Israel would just bomb Gaza indiscriminately and kill thousands of innocent civilians who had nothing to do with Hamas. And if that is in fact what Israel is doing, then I would say, yes, Israel deserves condemnation. However, it is not that simple. The reality is Hamas, again, is a terror organization. The UN itself has acknowledged, based on reviewing captured Hamas training modules, that one of Hamas's standard mode of operandi is they keep all their rocket launchers, all their military infrastructure is input in civilian buildings, hospitals, schools, basically areas that they know if Israel targets it, it will almost certainly result in civilian deaths. And Hamas actually rejoices every time their own civilians are killed because they know whenever Gazan civilians are killed, we can report it to the media. The media will showcase, you know, thousands of innocent Palestinians killed, and more terrorists will rally to us, and we'll win more and more friends around the world. So I mean, Hamas is truly a despicable terrorist organization that is doing everything in its power to get its own civilians killed in conflict with Israel. And now I can't prove this, but I firmly believe, based on what they themselves have said, I believe Hamas absolutely would murder their own civilians and then put the bodies where they want them to be so that they can report that Israel killed them. Again, I'm not saying that doesn't mean innocent Palestinian civilians haven't been killed by Israeli attacks. I'm sure they have. But you have to understand, you are fighting a dishonest terrorist group that is willing to do whatever it can to maximize its own civilian casualties for its own cause. So really, anybody who has taken the time to study warfare knows there is no such thing as like magic bombs or magic rockets. Obviously, when you fire those kinds of munitions, it's civilians are going to get killed in the crossfire.
Yeah, I'm just gonna Thanos snap away every single Hamas terrorist so as to only kill them and not kill any Palestinian civilians.
Exactly. Israel has no such weapons. It's, you know, would using ground troops be a little more precise? Yes, but at the same time, you have to know Israel can't when Israel sends its ground troops in, Hamas combined with booby trapping a civilian population that's largely hostile to Israel, and of course, you know, Hamas fighters that are intertwined with a civilian population, ground troops may not be, maybe even end up being even less precise. And another risk that Israel has to worry about. If you were an IDF soldier who had just seen his own wife and child murdered in this attack, do you think you'd be particularly careful about saving civilians during ground operations?
Probably not.
Probably
No.
not.
Probably not. So I think Israel even understands if they were to just send in ground troops, that doesn't minimize the possibility that their own troops might get rage blinders on and end up killing civilians, which of course would hurt their cause. It's worth noting, again, I 100% believe that in this conflict, there are Israeli soldiers who have deliberately murdered or mistreated Palestinians. Why do I say that? Because all you have to do is look up the Jerusalem Post or Haaretz newspaper to know Israel has actually arrested and prosecuted its own officers and soldiers when they have been found to have either murdered or mistreated Palestinians. Again, doesn't make the Israelis the good guys in the conflict. Doesn't mean this stuff doesn't mean there aren't others that got away with it. But it goes to show that at least one side in this conflict, Israel, to some degree, has held its own responsible for violating civilians' rights. On the other hand, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, if their people kill innocent civilians, they don't arrest you or prosecute you. They name schools and streets after you. So to say that the two sides are just not morally equivalent. Israel has, we know for at least from their own publications and evidence coming out of Gaza, they send mass text messages and call on the phone to, if they're about to bomb a location which has civilians nearby, they will try to notify the civilians beforehand, hey, we're about to bomb this area because there's Hamas there. Get out as fast as you possibly can. Meanwhile, Hamas will actually tell its people, don't listen, stay there, because Hamas wants its people to get killed. Now,
apparently there's another method that I learned of listening to Destiny, the Destiny lives or clips, anyways, as of recently. They have I don't remember what the term is actually called, but they have this one method of where they'll drop a smaller bomb on a building that will be loud enough so as to inform people that, hey, we're about to actually level this building, and then they'll bring in the bigger bomb, the bigger missile or whatever, that will actually just level the building that has all the Hamas equipment in it.
Exactly. It's called a knock bomb. Yeah. Basically, it's a non-explosive projectile that lands on the roof, shakes the building, so everyone inside's like, whoa, we're being targeted, and then later actually send in the bomb. Now, we can argue to the end for the rest of our lives, is that enough? Is Israel doing enough to save civilian lives? And if somebody has better options out there, I absolutely think they need to be discussed. But the point is, the IDF is taking measures to try and limit civilian deaths. The same cannot be said of the Hamas terrorists. Now, does that mean that their response is necessarily proportional? No. I would say, taking a look at the amount of bombings that have taken place, there's a good case to be made that it was an excessive response and probably more civilians died than were necessary. That's absolutely true. Now, do I have some sympathy for Israel in light of what happened? Some, but that's not an excuse. It doesn't mean that they automatically get a free pass for being excessive and causing civilian deaths. It may be the case that they still, I believe, have an obligation to deliberately target only Hamas military infrastructure and take every measure necessary to prevent civilian death. Now, another thing that has come up is the fact that Israel turned off the water and power in Gaza and basically said, Hamas, you've got at least 150 hostage Israelis. Give them back to us right now, and we will turn the water and power back on. If you don't, the water and power will stay off. And Hamas is like, we're not giving you your hostages back. Now, a lot of people have said, this is collective punishment. This is, there are civilians in Gaza who were not part of this attack, who are now being deprived of food, water, and electricity, thanks to Israel turning off the power. And admittedly, I am sympathetic. And I'm not convinced this is necessarily a proportionate response. Now, I think in fairness, Hamas, if they cared about their people at all, could get this turned on immediately if they just gave back the hostages, which they're not doing. So, I mean, there's blame to be had on both sides. Am I thrilled about Israel turning off water and power to innocent civilians? No. I think it's probably excessive. At the same time, you can't ignore the fact that Hamas could end this in an instant if they just gave back the hostages.
Right.
I think a lot of Israeli rhetoric has become extremely reckless. The minister of their defense department basically said we're fighting human animals, which is true if we're talking about Hamas. I think he was not careful to distinguish between Hamas and innocent civilians. I've seen plenty of Israelis and Americans like Lindsey Graham saying we need to level Gaza. I mean, that is, if you truly believe you just need to level the entire population and kill them all because of the terrorist group, you're no better than the terrorists who are saying we need to kill all Jews. Even if, strictly speaking, if even a Palestinian civilian who is not himself a terrorist but supports Hamas's activity, I believe in free speech. So long as he's not committing terrorism himself, the fact that he supports Hamas does not mean he automatically deserves to die. I mean, I think he's generally a despicable human being, but the fact freedom of speech means you have the right to believe things that are despicable. I can't, I can't say you don't deserve to live just because I think you hold despicable beliefs. That's modern wokeism. So in that regard, not everything Israel is doing is necessarily proportionate, but for those that want to say I'm simply on the side of peace, I think the unfortunate reality of the situation is Israel's in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If they do nothing, Hamas is going to continue attacking and killing their population. If they take drastic measures to try and defeat Hamas, a lot of innocent Palestinians are going to get killed. There's just no way around it. So, unfortunately, there have been enough peace talks. Hamas is not interested in peace. They want to kill all Israel. So I think, right or wrong, Israel has to do something about it. Now, do I think the U.S. or any other country should be giving a single dime to Israel or Palestine? Absolutely not. All you're doing is fueling the conflict, which the U.S., ironically enough, has done for long enough. We've been sending billions of dollars of aid to the Palestinians and the Israelis, which all has really done is ensure that this conflict goes on longer and longer. And let's face it, that's what the defense industrial complex really wants. The world at large, why do they support Israel? Why do they support Palestine? I would say at the back of it, you have the defense industrial complex that wants to ensure weapon sales around the globe remain high. And they have every interest in ensuring that these forever wars, like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, keep going on forever. So for that reason, the U.S. government should not be giving any money to Israel. They should not be giving any money to Palestine. This is true of every other country in the world. As much as I wish the answer is let's just support peace, let's tell them to lay down their arms and have another peace talk. We've seen how effective that is, and we're dealing with at least one side that has made clear they have no interest in peace. The only way this is going to get solved is if we withdraw all foreign aid to both sides, every other country take a step back and say, Israel, Hamas, you two solve this. May the best man win. And I really hate saying that because the unfortunate reality is a lot of innocent Israelis are going to get killed. A lot of innocent Palestinians are going to get killed. But are we really solving anything by advocating another ceasefire so that we can do this again in 5 years? Because that's basically all that's happened for the entire history of Israel.
Yeah. On the point about excuse me, collect my words. On the point of a Palestinian supporting Hamas, for example, that same logic of saying that a Palestinian who supports Hamas is just as culpable as Hamas themselves, and so therefore deserves death or whatever exact logic was that you were quoting there, my 2 cents. That same logic could be used against some kind of diehard interventionist neocon Republican who votes for George Bush or anyone else who voted for a Republican who was running passionately on the campaign of destroying literal entire civilian centers just for the sake of destroying entire civilian centers of Arabs. The same logic could be used right there and to justify killing entire swaths of Republican voters here in America. So therefore, I don't really approve. No, I don't approve of that kind of logic and line of thinking from the extremist anti-Hamas people, anti-Palestine
Exactly.
people.
Saying just level Gaza is arguably a genocidal statement. Now, but again, there are a lot of people arguing the IDF's campaign in Gaza right now is attempted genocide. That's just ridiculous. Genociders do not warn their victims beforehand so they can escape. Genociders do not and further, if Israel wanted to genocide, I was in a Twitter argument with an account earlier this weekend that basically told me Israel wants to genocide Palestinians. They just can't be open about it because there would be public backlash. I pointed out Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has the 6th strongest military in the world. And despite this, the Palestinian population has multiplied 8-fold since 1948. You're seriously going to try to tell me that the Israelis are actively trying to genocide the Palestinians? And the answer was, well, of course, the governments are inefficient. And my answer...
You took the words right out of my mouth, my 2 cents. I was about to ask that. Doesn't Israel have nukes that could just nuke them all to shit?
Exactly. Yeah. Basically, if you accept that if you honestly believe Israel is trying to genocide Palestinians, despite the fact that the Palestinian population has multiplied 8-fold since 1948, you either are an irrational conspiracy theorist, no amount of evidence could convince you otherwise, or you have to believe Israel is the most incompetent government in the history of the world. Because last I checked, every other government that actually tried to genocide a population did a much better job of it.
Really?
Yeah.
I like what the Destroyer said here. Call me crazy. However, I think this whole war is a scam for tyrants to get more power. Absolutely it is. That's exactly why the U.S. keeps sending billions of dollars over to Israel and Hamas at the same time.
Yep.
So definitely. If we're more onto addressing the chat more than anything right now, do we want to talk about the USS Liberty like Toasted Network asked a little bit earlier? I just noticed that we did not really address that when we were going through the timeline of events within Israel.
Okay. I mean, I have to be honest. I don't believe I'm well enough informed on that particular incident to speak to it. Darkon, do you believe you are?
No, I am not. Although I have heard that claim made. There is a certain former friend of ours, I'm sure you guys know who I'm talking about, who has mentioned that claim multiple times, and whenever he or anyone else who is passionately anti-Israel goes mentioning it, I had to go asking citation needed because new information to me at least, and I have to also wonder what context or is there being left out, maybe not by the people making the claim as far as an average anti-Israel person goes, but what context is being left out of the original claimers?
Okay, so I'm gonna again. This is the text I have gone to for a lot of information about this is Myths and Facts About Israel by Mitchell Bard. Again, he is writing from a pro-Israel perspective, so that is the bias he brings to it. But of all authors in this conflict, he's the one I found who is most deliberate with providing all his citations for issues. So let's look at what they have to say about the Israeli attack against the USS Liberty.
If he has to say something along the lines of, the leaders at the time really did try to attack or did attack the USS Liberty and they were at fault for that, then that would show that the guy is relatively unbiased.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So during the 1967 war, Israel deliberately attacked the USS Liberty. The Israeli attack on the USS Liberty was a grievous error largely attributable to the fact that it occurred in the midst of the confusion of a full-scale war in 1967. 10 official United States investigations and 3 official inquiries have all conclusively established the attack was a tragic mistake. On June 8, 1967, the 4th day of the Six-Day War, the Israeli High Command received reports that Israeli troops in El Arish were being fired upon from the sea, presumably by an Egyptian vessel. As they had the day before. The United States had announced that it had no naval forces within hundreds of miles of the battlefront on the floor of the United Nations a few days earlier. However, the USS Liberty, an American intelligence ship under dual control of the Defense Intelligence Agency and Central Intelligence Agency and the Sixth Fleet, was assigned to monitor the fighting. As a result of the series of United States communications failures whereby messages directing the ship not to approach within 100 miles were not received by the Liberty, the ship sailed to within 14 miles of the Sinai coast. The Israelis mistakenly thought this was the ship selling its soldiers and warplanes and torpedo boats attacks, killing 34 members of the Liberty's crew and wounding 171. Ships from the Sixth Fleet were directed to launch 4 attack aircraft with fighter cover to defend the Liberty, but the planes were recalled after a message was received at the White House that the Israelis had admitted they had attacked the ship.
So to be clear on what I said, I want to dismiss what I said earlier about this guy possibly saying that Israel was at fault. Apparently he's saying that it was a mistake more than anything.
Yes. Now, let me say this. What they're saying, what he is saying here is, I'm sure, factual. 10 independent U.S. investigations and 3 Israeli investigations concluded this was a mistake. Now, does that not necessarily mean it wasn't a mistake and there was a massive cover-up effort? Sure, that's possible.
Yeah.
But here's what I'd say. Here's how I always judge conspiracy theories. When it comes to conspiracy theories, there are 3 factors that have to be in place to justify whether or not the conspiracy theory is likely. That is, 1, there have to be a very small number of conspirators, because the more conspirators you have, the more likely it is the truth is going to get out. You need sudden and immediate communication between the conspirators to make sure that they keep straight. And you need a very small amount of time that the secret has to be kept before it more or less can be released to the world. Now, Is it entirely possible that this was a deliberate attack by Israel on the United States? Yes, that's possible. And, these investigations all could have been uncovered, could have been covered up by, a Mossad effort or a CIA effort or what have you. I struggle to see how it would have helped Israel's interest to piss off the United States in this particular conflict, given they were fighting multiple other armies at the time. But I mean, heck, if somebody else has researched this particular incident in more detail and thinks they have unique insight into it, I am definitely open to changing my view on that.
Well, what I heard about with the whole USS Liberty thing, one of the biggest conspiracy theories I heard about was it was like a Vietnam War-esque type situation where there's this big conspiracy theory that, what started the Vietnam conflict between the U.S. and Vietnam was one of our ships got bombed by the Vietnamese. However, there have been multiple conspiracy theorists coming out saying that ship was not actually bombed by the Vietnamese, but it was done by the U.S. government. Well, the same thing has come down that the USS Liberty was part of some kind of it was something like that. It was some kind of conspiracy like that. Only the Israelis were too obvious in this whole attack. They were too obvious. They were identified. And therefore, they had to basically say, no, okay, this was an accident. Israel didn't mean to do it, when really it was an attempt to get us involved in the conflict that was going on there militarily. And basically, the Israelis were doing it, but it was like they wanted to blame the other Middle Eastern powers that were at war with Israel at the time. So that's what I've heard, is that there was a massive conspiracy theory surrounding that was actually blown wide open, because the Israeli fighters were that partook in it were identified as Israeli fighters. But again, that's a conspiracy theory. I'm not going to put any stake in that. But that's something I have heard about.
Okay, now getting to Toasted's question here. How about the myth by Groypers that Israel spies on America more than Russia and China? You know what? I honestly think Israel probably does spy on America more than Russia and China. And the reason for that is not necessarily to undermine America, but Israel knows that if it loses American support, it would be in a significantly worse position. So I don't think they necessarily... I think it's probably true that Israel spies on America more than Russia and China, basically because they want to ensure that American support and American tax dollars keep flowing into Israel. Now, do I think American tax dollars should keep flowing into Israel? Absolutely not. Americans, again, as I say, it has probably come through that when it comes to this conflict, I am somewhat biased towards the plight of Jews living in Israel. That is not to be confused with support for the state of Israel. I do not support the state of Israel any more than I support the government of the United States. American taxpayers are under no obligation to have money stolen from them that could have been spent on their own interests and sent over to Israel. But admittedly, Israel, of course, benefits from American tax dollars coming in. So it's no surprise that Israel wants more American tax dollars to come in. I absolutely believe Israel would use its intelligence services to try and ensure that more American tax dollars keep coming into Israel. It's a government, and that's kind of what governments do.
Oh, absolutely.
And on their own best interest, but the American voter does not know their own best interest, my 2 cents.
Yeah.
They always vote against their own best interests, blah, 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 progressive gobbledygook.
Yeah, intelligence services are some of the most corrupt government agencies in existence. The CIA, the level of atrocities that the CIA has been behind in history is outstanding. I have no doubt that Mossad is behind just as many additional atrocities. That doesn't mean the American people are guilty for what the CIA does. It doesn't mean the Israelis are necessarily guilty for what Mossad does. It just goes to show that governments around the earth are pieces of shit.
All of them. Yes, all.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we've been going for about an hour and a half at this point. That's plenty of time for a rant. So, in summary, basically, here's where I'm at. To recap everything we've talked about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a long-standing history. And if you don't know the history of it, starting from the time the Romans kicked the Jews out in 135 AD, stretching all the way through the Arab conquering of the region under Muhammad or Muhammad's successors, the Ottoman control of the region, moving into the British Mandate of Palestine and forward to the modern state of Israel. If you aren't aware of all the facts going into that, you can't possibly understand the modern conflict going on. However, it is also important to note this is not just a territorial dispute. A lot of people have equated the current fight between Israel and Palestine as like between the British and the Irish Republican Army, but those two aren't comparable. The Irish Republican Army had actual territorial ambitions for which peaceful negotiations were possible. The Palestinians, in particular, not the whole people, but the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, are very clear that they do not merely have territorial ambitions. Their ambition is to destroy the state of Israel and to exterminate the Jews from the world, period. You can't have peace negotiations when one party is of that position.
Exactly.
Israel is not the good guys. Israel has done horrible things to Arab. There were, make no mistake, Zionist terrorist groups in the early stages of the founding of Israel, and they deserve to be condemned just as much as the Arab terrorist groups. The government of Israel has done horrible things. It is absolutely true that Israeli soldiers have tortured and killed innocent Palestinian civilians, and probably a lot of them got away with it. At least Israel has in the past arrested and prosecuted its own officers and soldiers for doing that. On the other hand, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas literally celebrates and names schools and streets after its terrorists that kill innocent Israeli civilians.
Oh, yeah.
Foreign tax dollars flowing into Israel or into Palestine are only perpetuating this conflict and ensuring that more people are going to die. Now, and finally, this probably sounds weird coming from a libertarian because I am not pro-war, but let's face it, even libertarians do have to acknowledge defensive wars to protect oneself and one's family are acceptable. There is only going to be peace if every other country in the world gets its fingers out of this conflict and says, Israel, Hamas, figure this out. And when you're done, we'll come back and talk about negotiations. That is unfortunately the only way this is going to get solved. And are a lot of innocent Palestinian civilians going to die in the process? Yes, and that is tragic. Are a lot of Israeli innocent civilians going to die in the process? Yes, and that is tragic. But unfortunately, that's the only way you're going to have peace. Ceasefires, peace negotiations, and foreign involvement are only going to make this conflict worse and perpetuate it because that's all it's done for the past 80 years.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that has been my rant on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't demand that everyone agree with me. If you're a hardcore Palestine supporter, you think anything I've said here is factually inaccurate or you need fixed, by all means, leave a comment. Let me know what your disagreements are. It is highly likely that throughout this stream I have said something that turns out to be factually inaccurate. I'm not above reproach. I've put a lot of research in this, but that doesn't mean I'm always right. And considering the breadth of history that we've gone over, it's highly likely I've gotten something wrong.
Speaking of being pro-Palestine, to address the chat very quickly, I don't think that so many young conservatives are necessarily pro-Palestine. They're just more like anti-Israel because unfortunately it's kind of trendy to hate on Israel on the internet nowadays.
Yeah.
It is trendy to be anti-Israel, let's face it. And, I think that's because all throughout history, what is the sympathy I have for Jewish people is that all throughout history, everywhere the Jews have ever gone, there has been anti-Semitism. And I'm extremely sympathetic to Jewish, not to the state of Israel, not to the government of Israel, but to Jewish people worldwide for wanting to have their own country. because where on earth are they? If they don't belong in Israel, as the pro-Palestinians are claiming, where are they supposed to go? Where have they ever gone that there wasn't, sophisticated anti-Semitic efforts to try and wipe them out? It's just that's the entire history. And to be fair, are there Jewish people in history who have done terrible things? Are there Jewish groups that are pieces of shit? Yes, the Anti-Defamation League is one of them. But that doesn't mean that all Jewish people are collectively responsible for these particular groups.
Now, I will say, with the caveat of what I said earlier, it's more like leftists who are not just pro-Palestine, because is anybody actually technically anti-Palestine to the point where that they want to kill all Palestinians?
No, like I said, I'm not aware of, other than the conspiracy theorists that say Israel secretly wants to kill all Palestinians while allowing their population to flourish. There is no actual group out there that is calling for the genocide of the Palestinians. I should say, with the exception of some angry Israelis who have said it in the past week, which they're wrong. It's terrible. But at the same time, I'll grant them some sympathy since they have rage blinders on, considering what just happened to them.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not just that. It's more like far leftists are pro-Hamas, just outright pro-killing Israel. As people are like showing their face, second thought, and maybe not so much Vosh pretty close to it anyways.
Oh, Vosh has been going on about this?
Well, second thought, definitely. I mean, people like Destiny and Sitch and Adam have been reading tweets from him. I can't remember the specific wording, but just giving praise to the initial attacks. Given justification for them.
Now, addressing this comment from J.C. Armitage, didn't the UN declare Israel an apartheid state? Yes, I believe it did. But here, what's so ridiculous about this claim is that 20% of the population of Israel is Arab. All the citizens of Israel that are Arab have all the same rights and privileges as any other citizen. The only legal distinction between Arab citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel is that Arabs are not required to be conscripted into the IDF, although many do voluntarily join of their own accord. And the reason for that is they say they wouldn't want Arab Israelis to be forced to fight against people they consider to be their own brethren. Nonetheless, there are Arabs currently serving in the IDF who are citizens of Israel. And I think what makes this most ridiculous, on the article that I shared from my own fact here, I'm going to post this. I'm going to find the actual article and I will share it here. All right. So here is an article written by a female Arab citizen of Israel criticizing the government of Israel. It's from the Haaretz, which is a Jewish newspaper. Now, this is a Arab woman who is a citizen of Israel who writes an article in his Israeli newspaper criticizing the government of Israel and stating that she feels she is being mistreated in Israel. Now, is it true? Maybe, but I can't help but ignore the fact that you are an Arab woman living in Israel and you just published an article in an Israeli newspaper criticizing the government of Israel. I find it very hard to believe you are able to do that if you are legitimately being discriminated against.
Really? Yeah.
So the idea that Israel is an apartheid state, I mean, that's just, there are legitimate apartheid states in history, like South Africa. If you cannot claim that Israel is an apartheid state when they have actual Arab citizens who have all the same rights, and their own Arab citizens have enough freedom of speech to actually criticize the government of Israel in Israeli newspapers. That's it's not comparable. And further, what Arab country in the region are Jewish women allowed to publish such articles? You think a Jewish woman in Saudi Arabia is allowed to criticize the government? You think a Jewish woman in Iran is allowed to criticize the government? I mean, come on.
Hell no.
Yeah, and the UN doesn't seem the least bit concerned about those countries. So that's just goes to show the UN is a garbage organization as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't trust them.
No.
Yeah, UN is a waste of money and time. Absolutely. And Toasted asks, would you ever debate a Groiper on this? Sure. If there's one that wants to debate, they can get in touch with me. Honestly, the person I would love to debate on this I know she probably isn't interested in talking to me, but Carrie Wedler, if you happen to be responding to this, you made a video a while ago called How I Became a Self-Hating Jew. I responded to that video with fact-checking a self-hating Jew. And I would love to have a discussion with you about this if you want to defend the more anti-Israel side of this debate. And she of course, has a Jewish background too, so I'd love to debate her on that.
Yeah.
I'd love to be on that too.
Mm-hmm. So if anyone knows how to get in touch with her, by all means, please do. But as a final point before we end, one important thing to remember: even there are in fact Jews like Carrie Wedler and others who, despite being Jewish, are pretty anti-Israel in their rhetoric and are much more pro-Palestinian in how they view the conflict. And I think they are certainly entitled to their opinion, and I fully support their right to free speech. But please remember, groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Palestinian Authority, they are not saying, hey, we're not against Jews, we're just against Israel, and we fully stand in solidarity with Jews that speak out against Israel. No, they've been absolutely clear. We do not distinguish between pro-Israel Jews and anti-Israel Jews. We hate them all, and we want to kill them all. And I think there was a pretty telling clip that this was several years old, but there was a Jewish speaker by the name of David Horowitz who was speaking on a college campus a couple of years ago. And there was a female Muslim student who was a member of the Muslim Students Association who came up, who asked a question, and she said, "You asserted that the Muslim Students Association of America is a propaganda tool for terrorist groups. And I want to say that's false. We don't get funding from anybody." And he went on to say, he provided the citation that he had in support of that, but he had a discussion with her briefly, and he said, "I am a Jew. The leader of Hezbollah has stated that he wants all of us to gather in Israel so he can kill us all at once, and it saves him the trouble of having to hunt us down globally. Do you or do you not support Hezbollah?" And she answered, "I support Hezbollah." And I was just like, well, what more do you want people to say? I mean, these are allegedly, a lot of people try to say, I'm not anti-Israel. And yet, when given the opportunity, they speak out in favor of actual terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, who are openly calling for the extermination of Jews worldwide. It's despicable. So,
yeah.
Yep. So there is my rant. Look, again, despite all this, I'm not on either side. I don't have a dog in this game. Israel's not my country. It's on them to work out their own problems. But nonetheless, if your position is truly that you can sympathize with actual terrorists, I think you need to rethink your position on this subject. Really? So, Night Shift, Dark Khan, thanks for joining me. And as always,
thanks for the invite.
No, absolutely, man.
That was my 2 cents. You can take it for what it's worth.